Hey, my name's Jim Egan. I'm the curator of the Newport Tower Museum. I had this museum across the street from the tower for the last 10 years, and I've been studying the tower for 40 years. I've written 20 books on the tower, and so I've summarized it briefly in the museum. I'll explain a little bit about it. There's 5 theories about who built the tower. The Vikings in 1150, the Templars in 1398, the Chinese in 1421, the Portuguese in 1501, and the first governor of Rhode Island calls this his stone-built windmill in the year 1677. Does it look like a windmill to you? I don't think so. Most people don't study the first governor of Rhode Island. In fact, he's been thrown out of Rhode Island history because his name is Benedict Arnold. Not the traitor, but the great-great-great-grandfather of the traitor, Benedict Arnold. But because his name is Benedict Arnold, shh, we don't want him in Rhode Island history. So nobody really studies him. But I went and found his will, and where he writes my stone-built windmill, he has these asterisks around it. And now an asterisk back then didn't refer to anything in the margin. It meant I'm omitting something. So he's trying to tell us that he wants to call it a windmill for some reason. And I don't know if you know this, but sometimes politicians shade the truth. I know, I don't want to come new to you, but anyway, the tower has these incredible features. It's perfectly circular. It's got these 8 pillars, and you see it's down here. It had a view over the entire bay. You can see all over Newport Harbor, Narragansett Bay. In the tower are these 8 pillars, and above each is a beam socket. So there were 4 beams that crisscrossed, made a tic-tac-toe pattern like that. So this is the first floor. These are the beam sockets for the second floor. So this is a room, and inside this room is a fireplace, several niches in the wall, and 3 windows. The northeast window, the west window, and the south window. And in the early 1990s, Professor William Penhallow, a professor of astronomy and physics from the University of Rhode Island, found these astronomical alignments in the windows of the tower. He says if you stand here on one day out of every 18.6 years, look through the west window, through the tower, and out the northeast window, through these 2 windows, on December 26, 1996, at 7 o'clock at night, you will see the full moon. So I went there, exactly the day and time he said. Sure enough, a bright full moon through all the windows. This only happens once every 18.6 years. It happened again in 2015, and it won't happen again until 2033. It's called lunar minor. It's the southernmost of all the northernmost risings of the moon. The other important astronomical alignment he found was the sun alignment. On the winter solstice, December 21st, every year, if you stand here in this corner of the park, look through the west window, through the tower, and out the south window, you will see the sun at around 7:30. At 7 o'clock it rises up, and there's this niche where you can see right through the 2 windows, and there it is. It shines right through the 2 windows. The event lasts for about 20 minutes, and then it won't happen again until the next solstice. And I've been there every year. You see it works every year. These are pictures from the last 10 years, and I just saw it again this year because yesterday was the winter solstice. It was beautiful, spectacular morning. So the professor's given a lecture one time to the New England Antiquities Research Association. We're a group of people in New England who study lithic structures, stone chambers, stone walls all around. And he said that interior room probably acted like a Camera Obscura solar disk calendar room. What's that? Well, I'm going to show you what a Camera Obscura is. Camera Obscura means dark room. In a dark room with one small hole, the image of what's outside appears on the interior. So I'm going to use this as a projection board here, and let me just close up this the windows, and I'm going to darken the room. So Camera Obscura means a dark room. In a dark room with one small hole, the image of what's outside appears on the interior. So here's the aperture that we're going to use, and I've darkened the entire room. And this is just a white board, and on the board you'll see the image of what's happening on Bellevue Avenue as we speak. You see the guy walking across here? These are cars driving through Bellevue Avenue. Here's a car parked out there, and you see the beautiful sky and everything. All of the trees, you'll see the entire thing, and the image fills the entire room. You see it's on the floor, it's on the ceiling, it's all over. So why is the image upside down? Well, light travels in a straight line. The light from up above all of the treetops. When that comes down through that hole, it's going to continue and be down here. But the light from below, the flowers on the sidewalk, they're going to be up here. So everything that's on the left outside is on the right inside, and everything on the right is on the left. The whole image flips upside down and backwards. And you brought with you today 2 camera obscuras each, your eyeballs. Your eye is a camera obscura. We see things upside down on our retina, and this is how we see. Well, the professor was giving this lecture one day at the tower, and he said the interior of the tower was probably plastered with white plaster. This is what was going on inside the tower. Now, why would he say that? Well, in order to show you, I'm going to make another camera obscura, and this one just has a hole. This particular one has a lens in it. It sharpened it a little bit, but if you have a hole anywhere in the world, in a dark room, you'll see the image of what's outside. So here you'll see on this piece of opaque paper the image of what's happened. Now, the smaller the hole, the sharper the image. Let's go to a smaller hole here, and it's a little sharper. But now let's go to the smallest hole, and there you'll see, let me darken it up here, the image of what's happening outside as we speak. Now, in this image here, this is the sky here. This is the ground. But there's a bright spot right there. Do you know what that bright spot is? Actually, it looks like 2 bright spots, but that's because there's a tree and it's in the way. That is the image of the sun. We call it the solar disk. And if I take this sheet away, you'll see that the solar disk is making a spot on the floor inside the camera obscura. Now, all of a sudden, I don't see the spot. I think we just have it to, it happened to hit it right where it's going through the tree. Oh, there it is, right there. So let me go to the smallest hole. I didn't realize that it was way over here because it's still morning time. So this spot right here, that spot that you see right there, that is the image of the sun. Let me get out of the way. So what happens is around sunrise, this solar disk is on the wall over here, and it will slowly move, and it moves across the floor 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. It's around 9 o'clock, actually 10 o'clock, but this is daylight savings time. And then during the day, it will move across here at 10 o'clock, 11, 12 o'clock. It will be directly north-south, and then 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. This is on December 21st. That's why it's way up here in the room. The next day, it'll be a little bit lower, and then a little bit lower, and a little bit lower. And by March 21st, the equinox, the sun will be here at sunrise, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11, and it'll go across here. This is the spring equinox. And then during the summer, when the sun is really high in the sky outside, the solar disk goes across the floor here at 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then it works its way up again. That's June 21st. And then by September 21st, the fall equinox, it goes across the middle, and then it works its way back up again. And a year from now, that sun will be in the exact same position going across here. So not only can you tell the time of day this way, you can tell the day of the year this way. It's a calendar and a clock. And the whole thing is an inside-out sundial, and it's also a camera. Here is a 4 by 5 inch camera, like a square box with a lens on it, and this is the image on the ground glass of the back of the camera. Let me get this hole exactly open, and this is the image on the ground glass of the back of a camera. There you can see the solar disk up in the sky that's coming through and shining over there. So I was a professional photographer for 40 years. So I said, well, if I study the history of the camera obscura, I'll be able to figure out who built the tower. And that's how I was able to figure out who built the Tower of Mystery across the street. So Professor Penhallow found that the solstice event goes through the windows, but we also wondered about the equinox. There's something very unusual that happens on the equinox, which is twice a year, March 21st and September 21st. On that day, the sun at sunset comes through the west window, and it almost goes into the middle of the fireplace. That's the patch of light coming through the west window. And here you'll see that this progress of the patch of light, about a half an hour before sunset, it's a square box directly underneath the fireplace. and then it works its way up, but because they built houses on the western side of the park, it gets blocked up a little bit. So after this, it just kind of diffuses, but we could tell that the box would be on the right-hand side of the fireplace on the equinox, and we couldn't figure out, well, if they were doing astronomical alignments, why didn't they put it so it fell right into the fireplace? Well, I couldn't build a camera obscura at the tower because it doesn't have a roof and it doesn't have a floor. So my photography assistant, John Tavares, and I, we found this room down on Mill Street, up on the 3rd floor of an old firehouse, that we could block up all of the windows. It was an old stairwell, and we blocked it up except for one small hole in one window, set up a 9-foot white seamless paper, and this is the image of what's happening outside on the inside, and it's the same view that the tower once had. So here is the solar disk in the blue sky. Here you can see the Pell Bridge and Goat Island, and this is a Mill Street coming down here. Well, what's that bright spot right there? Why is it brighter there than any place else? Well, if you look at this the correct way, you'll see that this is the image of the light shining off the water in late afternoon. And it makes all these little white sparkles, and we call it fiery water. In the Camera Obscura, it's absolutely dazzling to see on the wall. And this is nothing new that people were fascinated by this. In the 1600s, a physicist by the name of Robert Boyle, who wrote Boyle's Law on gases, he says, in a darkened room, I use a convex lens to project the images of a river about a quarter mile away, which is being shined on by the sun. It looked like millions of shining fish scales, which sparkled as the wind, sun, and river changed. We call this the fiery water. Well, in my photography studio up in Providence, I had a beautiful view of the I was on the 8th floor and had a beautiful view of all the sunsets throughout the day. So I turned the whole studio into a Camera Obscura solar disk calendar room and followed the sun all year long. At the end of the day, after the sun had gone across the floor, this solar disk, the image of the sun, worked its way up, and I drew a circle on the wall on a piece of paper where it was every minute. So I had the path that it took that day, and then the next day it had moved over. You see here I am drawing an image around, a pencil image around the solar disk. Well, in summer it was here, but by winter it was way at the other end of the studio. So I made a Camera Obscura solar disk at sunset calendar in my studio. So in the summer it was here, and then in the fall the solar disk at sunset was here, and then by winter it was here, and then it would work its way back again. Well, I transferred that data to the interior of the tower, and here's what I found. You see, on the equinox, the middle of the year, this solar disk is right on the right-hand edge of the fireplace, because it would be in the middle of this square box right here. And I pieced all of this stuff together, and here's what I figured out. On that day of the equinox, the solar disk, the image of the sun, if the west window was all blocked up, would be here and here, and then it would be here, right underneath, directly underneath the fireplace at 5:15, which is a half an hour before sunset. Then it would work its way out, it would finally be extinguished. What that means is, if this was a Camera Obscura, the solar disk would be here, and the image of the fire would be right inside the fireplace on the equinox. So on that day, you have the solar disk, you could start a fire up, and then you got the fiery water right inside of the fireplace. And this happens on March 21st, which is, in zodiacal terms, the first of Aries. And can anyone tell me what kind of sign Aries is? Fire sign, and just before it is Pisces. Can anyone tell me what sign of Pisces is?
Water.
So when you go from water to fire, you go to fiery water inside of the fireplace. Whoa! Who would have designed a tower with this incredible magic stuff? Not just this, but the alignments that Professor Penhallow had. I couldn't believe it. So I studied the history of the Camera Obscura. And when I found that Aristotle talks about it, he says, how come in wicker work we have these circles underneath the squares and not round things? Well, each one is an image of the sun. Here I am in Lindos, Greece, and it's a town covered with grapevines. And so you get all these little pinholes, and each one of these is an image of the sun, a solar disk. I was like, this is a magical place to me. We don't get that too much in New England because we don't have broadleaf trees like that. And then I found out that in 850, a Chinese philosopher said light behaves like ore in an ore lock. He says everything is backwards. Everything works sort of the opposite. And then in 875, a monk named Helperic says, note each day with the sun at sunrise passes through an aperture and falls on the western wall of the room. He was doing around 875 the same thing that I was doing in my photography studio. This is nothing new. And then around 1025, the Arabs did tests where they set up 5 candles in one room, had a hole into another dark room, and they saw that when they blew out the 5th candle, the first candle blew out in here. They first determined that light travels in a straight line. And then around 1300, these philosophers like Roger Bacon and John Peckham, they used the camera obscura to view the solar disk, and so it wouldn't burn out their eyes. But the main use of the camera obscura was in the Renaissance. In the year 1582, they built these giant camera obscura rooms. They converted cathedrals that had already been constructed into camera obscura rooms. In other words, this is Santa Maria degli Angeli in Rome, and they put an aperture up in the ceiling, and then down on the floor in marble and bronze, they marked off every day of the year in what's called a Meridiana Line. Meridiana means noon, exactly like I have here, the noon line. This interior had been done by Michelangelo, but they retrofitted it, and they called this a heliograph. It was a timepiece of God inside of the church. It was very sacred. And by making these camera obscuras inside of the churches, and by watching with the sun crossed on the summer solstice, on the equinox, and on the winter solstice, and counting the number of days, they were able to prove to Pope Gregory XIII that the Julian calendar that Julius Caesar had invented was out of sync from the sun by 10 days, leading to the Gregorian calendar reform of 1582. That's the calendar we still use today. And so people all over Europe changed it. The Pope, they said to the Pope, you don't really need to change the calendar because it's all just relative, but you'll be celebrating Easter on the wrong day. Whoa, I don't want to do that. So the Pope changed it. And so this idea of the camera obscura, the first image we have is Geoffricius in 1544, and he draws a picture of the camera obscura inside a dark room. And one of his students was a guy by the name of John Dee. John Dee was a philosopher for Queen Elizabeth, and he's the only man in Elizabethan England who was known to have written about the camera obscura. He showed the Polish ambassador an eclipse of the sun in the year 1583. And then after that, in the 1700s, artists started using the camera obscura as drawing aids. These were little boxes, and they could learn the art of perspective. And then in the 1800s, they put film in the back. And then in the 1900s, they invented photography in boxes that were made popularized. And then they got Nikons and Leicas and film cameras. And now we take pictures of our cell phone. But even in a cell phone, you have to have a camera obscura. That's the way that light works. So as I was studying the history of optics, as well as the history of the first governor of Rhode Island, who was a governor for 8 terms, and I claim that he knew who built the tower, one day I was in the library and serendipity happened. You know what that means? Something unexpected. I was in the library and I saw this book, and it says, Historical Names for Narragansett Bay. And the list started with Verrazano in 1525, and then the Spanish called this bay the Bay of Santa Bautista. And then I saw this, the John Dee Bay and River, 1583. John Dee? Why would Narragansett Bay, this beautiful bay in Rhode Island, be named after John Dee? He was the guy that knew about the camera obscura. So I started studying about John Dee. He was a mathematician, astronomer, an expert on navigation and cartography. He had a library of, all these books have been written about John Dee. He had a library of 4,000 books. This is John Dee's library catalog. He wrote down every book that he owned, all the greatest Greek, Roman, Latin works. And in 1577, he was one of the top advisors to Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth reigned from 1558 to 1603, one of the greatest rulers ever. And these are her 2 top advisors here. And here's Dee right here. He's got this beautiful white beard, and he's like a Dumbledore or a Gandalf character, and Prospero of the Tempest. These have all been modeled after this guy, John Dee. He was a great wizard in all of England, but he was also an incredibly smart mathematician. And so in 1577, he writes these series of books convincing Queen Elizabeth she has a legal right to all of North America, and she needs to get a foothold there because Spain was becoming a superpower. They had all the gold from Mexico and the silver from Peru. And he said, if we don't get a foothold, they're becoming a superpower. They're going to come and wipe us out. So John Dee, in this book here, is called The Limits of the British Empire. He also coins the term the British Empire, and he said the first start for it would be getting a foothold in the New World. He also said that England needs to build a navy of 60 to 80 large ships and hire 600 seamen because Spain was imminent to attack. Dee also quotes King Arthur and Prince Madoc and John Sebastian Cabot, people who had been to the New World and claimed it for England, and as a result, he said the Queen had a legal right to claiming it. He was also the navigational guide to all the great Elizabethan explorers. This is the front cover of Dee's book. Here's the Queen guiding the ship of state to the New World. These 5 ships have come down on an expedition, and here the people of England are pleading on their knees, send forth a sailing expedition to build a steadfast watch post. And here's the watch post here, and here is the Yahweh, God, the sun, the moon, the archangel Michael, written in Hebrew there. And so this is a rebus. There are all of these clues in this about this colonization effort. 1 month later, the Queen deeds all of North America to one of her bravest courtiers. He was a general in the war in Ireland, Sir Humphrey Gilbert. And Gilbert was a man who knew how to manage men and put this whole project together. And Gilbert was so appreciative of the work that Dee did with the Queen, he gives Dee all the lands north of the 50-degree line. That's all of Alaska, Canada, and Greenland went to Dee. Gilbert got all the rest. He had 7 years, and any place that he wanted to claim to be his own, he had to build a building, occupy it for a year. So they made an attempt in 1578, but they got halfway across the ocean and they hit a tempest, so they had to head back. And then they were running out of time, and it got to be 1582, and they didn't have enough money for this expedition. So Walsingham, the Secretary of State, he gets this Catholic sympathizer. You see, England had been Catholic for over 4 centuries with Sir Henry VIII, and then his son Edward VI was Protestant for 5 years. And then his second child, Mary, she was Catholic, and she ruled for 5 years. And then Elizabeth comes to the throne, and she is instantly Protestant. She asked Dee to select a date for her coronation. And but you see, they had been through these tumultuous times, and so the Catholics were being persecuted now in Elizabethan England. But they said to this wealthy Catholic sympathizer, if you fund Sir Humphrey Gilbert's expedition, all the colonists that settle in that New World can have complete freedom of religion. You can do your Catholic stuff over in the New World, you just can't do it here. So they put up all of this money, this guy Sir George Peckham. Now, we know all of this because, first off, John Dee drew a map. And he says to Peckham, when Peckham goes over his house, you don't want to go to Florida, that's where the Spanish are, and Cuba and Jamaica or South America. You want to go up here to this triangular island, which is Block Island, little island off the coast, which is triangular. And just north, you'll find this beautiful bay at 42 degrees. That's where you want to settle. Well, we know all this because in 1936, they found this deed in the Elizabethan State Papers between Sir Humphrey Gilbert and Sir George Peckham, dated 1583. I deed you all that river report called by Master John Dee the Dee River, which by the description of Verrazano, it tells us he uses Verrazano's description, and Verrazano had come here to this bay in 1525. It lies at a northerly latitude at 42 degrees, which it does, mouth open to the south, a half a league broad, and then it goes north for 12 leagues, and then it makes a bay 20 leagues in circumference, in which there are 5 small islands. Perfect description of Narragansett Bay. The whole colony was taken up about half of what is now Connecticut and most of Rhode Island. This has been known since 1934 when they wrote about it in an article in the Historical Society, Rhode Island Historical Society Journal, the Dee River, 1583. And it's been confirmed by David Beers Quinn, Samuel Eliot Morrison, all the great writers. They'll all tell you that this is exactly Narragansett Bay where this colonization effort was going to take place, but not one Rhode Island historian book has ever written about it. I don't know why. So what happened? 5 ships set sail in 1583 with Sir Humphrey Gilbert. One day out, the bark Raleigh got a contagious disease. They had to head back home. The other 4 ships made it as far as St. John's in Newfoundland. More people got sick, so they sent the Swallow home. These other 3 ships stayed there for 2 weeks to revictualize. And then coming down the coast to the Dee River, off the coast of Nova Scotia, they hit a tempest near Sable Island. They were traveling in the North Atlantic in September of 1583, and that's where the perfect storm was. Well, they hit the perfect storm. All of their supplies were on the Delight, this largest ship. It hit a sandbar, got crushed to pieces. The two smaller ships decided to head back to England to get more men and supplies, and off the coast of the Azores, almost home, they hit another tempest. Sir Humphrey Gilbert's ship got swallowed up a huge wave and he drowned. The deed to North America became void because it was only in his name. So historians have said, well, he couldn't have built the tower, Jim. He only made it as far as Halifax and never made it down the coast, and that's true. But what I found in reading the history is that there was a preliminary expedition a year earlier. Sir Humphrey Gilbert and Sir George Peckham sent Anthony Brigham, who was a friend of Peckham, with 2 ships and 80 men, and I claim they came here and built this tower to be the city center of this first Elizabethan colony in the New World. This was to be the foothold of the New World. There were supposed to be 10,000 people here the very first year. But because Sir Humphrey Gilbert drowned, the deed to North America became void, and this colonization effort and the tower, which I claim had been built in the year 1582, and they were just waiting for Sir Humphrey to arrive, and he never arrived. So Brigham goes back to England, and he talks to Sir Francis Walsingham, the Secretary of State, and they tried to get more funds for this expedition, but it wasn't going to work. A year later, the Queen deeds all of North America to Sir Humphrey Gilbert's younger half-brother, and you know who he was. His name was Sir Walter Raleigh, who made 3 expeditions to Roanoke Island in 1584, 5, and 7. He went further south where there was a longer growing season, and then the whole thing there, the lost colony Groton, that failed as well. But that was Sir Humphrey Gilbert's younger brother. The two of them grew up together, but nobody's ever heard of Gilbert because he never made it past Maine, and we're Americans, we don't really care about Canadian history. But he's very famous up there. If you go to Canada, you'll see he's on stamps, and he's got a picture and statue everywhere. He's very famous, but he wasn't headed there. This is where he was headed. Well, in this same year, 1583, that Sir Humphrey Gilbert drowned, something else happened. France, Italy, Germany, Spain, they all changed the calendar because the Pope had decreed it. But in England, the Queen didn't know what to do. She's been excommunicated. She didn't have to listen to some guy from Italy. But she was concerned because if she didn't change, she'd be off by 10 days if the English people were trading with France. She needed advice. What should she do? Who did she turn to for advice? John Dee. At her request, he writes a 60-page treatise on the reform of the calendar, in which he says, yeah, you can tell from the Camera Obscura rooms we're off by 10 days. We've known it for years. He says, Elizabeth, our Empress bright, who in the year of 83 thus made truth come to light, and civil year with heaven agree. And he draws this thing called the circle of time, which starts down at the bottom with Adam, Enoch, here's my translation, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, the sons of Israel, Olympic Games, the Greeks, Jesus Christ, Mohammed, Al-Kindi, Copernicus, the very last one, Queen Elizabeth, the reformer of the year for the next Christian epoch, and that's to begin in 1583, the exact same year I say that tower was built across the street. So this tower represents not only the beginning of the British Empire, and also the birth of this new time. It's the very reason why I'm speaking to you in English today. Otherwise I'd be speaking Spanish or French or Native American or something. So John Dee in 1582 was on top of the world. He had solved the problem of religious strife. The new world was opening up. The new time was opening up, and they gave him these rectories at £1,000 a year. The following year, he was totally bummed out. Sir Humphrey Gilbert drowned. The Queen approved the plan for the calendar, but the head of the English Church, Edmund Grindal, said, if there's something the Pope is doing, we don't want to do that. They did not make the change. For the next 169 years, English calendar was different European calendars by 10 days because they didn't listen to Dee. 169 years. It wasn't until 1752 they finally changed. So in 1582, when they rejected that, and they also took away the rectories that they were going to give him because the head of the English Church didn't like John Dee. Dee gets on a boat with his family and leaves England. He hires this fellow who's a scryer who can read crystal balls, and they get on a boat and they travel all across to the greatest courts throughout Northern Europe. And but before Dee had left and on this wild trip, which sort of changed his life in 1583, he'd written over 40 books. And one of the books is the first English translation of Euclid, the greatest geometry book ever written. And he adds addendums and corollaries to many of the 465 propositions. And he also defines all the known mathematical arts at the time: perspective, music, astronomy, cosmography. And he says these are all related, this 19 of them, to 2 things: arithmetic and geometry. Total math geek. Everything about mathematics for John Dee. He says an architect's work must be based on geometry, arithmetic, optics. He says, regarding optics, I mean the lights of heaven are well led in the buildings from certain quarters of the world. It's exactly what Penhallow found in this building. The lights from the shine right through it. He says, if you don't understand equinoxes and solstices, you won't understand the art of horometry, the art of keeping time. He says, I built horizontal dials and mural dials, all sorts of dials when I was young. But sometimes you can't see the sun, moon, and the stars. So industrious mechanics invented a way to keep track of time using a flow of water clocks. And then he says running sand and gears and weights and now springs. But all of these methods require correction over time because the inaccuracy of their own operation. Well, how would they correct these clocks if they were off a little bit? He says there remains among the philosophers a more excellent, marvelous way than all of these to imitate the motion of the skies, which you shall learn more of by further search and weightier studies. But he says, in the corner here, in this aside, he says it's a perpetual motion. Well, he's referring to the Camera Obscura solar disk calendar room where the sun moves across the floor, perpetually moving, because the sun's always moving in the sky. And so why doesn't he say, make a dark room, put a hole in it, and you'll have a calendar on the floor to keep you the time of day and the day? Why doesn't he say that? Well, just imagine. Oh, we were over at Dee's house. He closed off all of the doors, darkened everything except for one small hole. And inside, everybody was walking upside down on the wall. I saw Fred outside on his horse with the purple hat. I know Fred. Fred was upside down. The birds were below him. The flowers were up above. Yeah, we were at Dee's house. We all saw it. You get your head cut off of that stuff. You saw it. It's like magic. So Dee had to write cryptically about the Camera Obscura. That's what these two books are about. This one's called Proputomata Aphoristica, which in Greek means preparatory aphorisms. And it's 120 aphorisms about astronomy and astrology. And you see he's got the sun column, the moon column, and these are Corinthian pilasters and a solid entablature and a dome with stars. Dee was fascinated by classical architecture, and he invents this symbol called the Monas symbol, which has 4 parts to it. It's the moon, the sun, the cross of the elements, fire, air, earth, and water, and the symbol for Aries, the first of the zodiacal signs, all in one image. And he felt that this was a very spiritual thing. And as a result, after coming up with it in this book, he wrote another book called the Monas Hieroglyphica, which means sacred symbol of oneness, all based on this sigil, or his drawing here with the moon, the sun, the cross, the elements, and the symbol for Aries. Here you got it in an egg, and this is the sun column, the moon column. Mercury, when made stable by a single point, becomes the parent and king of all the planets, all these little riddles. And he dedicates it to Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, the head of all of Northern Europe, the king of Northern Europe. And at the top he writes, he who does not understand should either learn or keep silent. Well, the Queen sees it and says, John, what's with this book? So he spends a whole day explaining it to Queen Elizabeth. And when he goes to Prague, he explains it to the Emperor's son, Rudolph II. And at the very end of Dee's book, he has this chart called Thus the World Was Created. It summarizes his entire cosmology in one chart. Sic factus est mundus, thus the world was created. And up at the top you have the supercelestial area, and then down below you have the terrestrial area, but down here he's got fire, air, earth, and water, 1 through 1,000. The Monas symbol, upside down and backwards. The numbers 1 through 7. Body, mind, spirit, 1, 2, 2, 3. And black, clear, yellow, red, these are alchemical stages, 12, 13, 24, 25. And up on the top, he's got 1 through 8, metamorphosis, consummata, the horizon of eternity. No one's been able to figure out the chart or his book for the last 450 years. They say the knowledge of what he's talking about is no longer with us. But there was one person who was able to figure out everything in the chart and decipher his whole book, which, by the way, is written in Latin. Some people think it was Sir Isaac Newton because he lived in the 1700s and he was interested in alchemy too. But it wasn't Newton who was able to figure out the book. You know who it was? Yours truly, Jim Egan. Oh, sure, Jim. How'd you figure that out? Well, here's how I figured it out. What I did was I went to the Library of Congress. I got a copy of its book. It's written in Latin, and I reproduced it for the first time since its original 1564 printing in its original size and its original scale. I hired a Latin translator, and we went through sentence by sentence, and I learned what exactly he was saying. I also got all the other 6 known translations over the years that people have done of it. And a lot of them are done by English teachers and scholars. They don't really have an understanding of mathematics. Well, I understood to do with the mathematics, so I was able to figure it out. So here is my translation, and you see into English. And at the beginning is a letter to Maximilian. Then he starts off with point, line, circle, very geometric. Everything's geometric. And he talks about the Monas symbol, and he breaks it up in different ways. He uses that as a rhetorical device. For example, he says 2 V's is like an X. In Roman numerals, 5 and 5 makes 10, and 2 L's is like 50, and 50 makes 100. He makes these little riddles, which all have to do with numbers. But at the very end of his book, one of the last chapters, he says it's very important that you make this design exactly to these proportions. He goes through the entire geometric proof. He says the diameter of that has to equal the diameter of that to the length of that, and that's half the length of that. Very important, otherwise it loses all of its power. Now, he says you can make it a little bit thicker for ornament, but it has to be exactly those proportions. And at the end, where he has his chart, he has another chart that says there are various fixed limits in number, and he boils it down to one number, the magistralia number, the philosopher's stone of number. He calls it the lipidification fermentation. That number is 252. Nobody was able to figure out what 252 is all of these years. That kind of puzzled people. Well, I figured out what 252 was. I figured out the whole book, and inside this book, I found a hidden blueprint for the tower that's across the street. That's right, hidden blueprint. But I had a tool to figure out 252 that people didn't have in the 1800s and 1900s. Guess what tool I used? Abacus, slide rule, nope. Hand calculator, nope. You know how I figured out 252? I Googled it. And when I Googled 252, guess who shows up? Well, to that, you got to come into the back room, the magisterial room, which not too many people get to come into, but if you want to know, you can come in. So when I Google 252, guess who shows up? This guy, Buckminster Fuller, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. Buckminster Fuller invented the Geodesic Dome. If you go down to Walt Disney World in Florida, that dome, it's all made out of triangles. He invented it around 1950. And so they even made a stamp of him in 2004. And before he died, he said, I'm going to write down the most important things I learned here on Earth. And he did in these 2 books called Synergetics 1 and Synergetics 2. They're a little hard to understand, but there was a woman who studied with him at MIT named Amy Edmondson, and she wrote a fuller explanation. Once you read Amy, then you'll understand exactly what he understood. And Bunky says that a 6-sided figure does not hold its shape. 5-sided does not hold its shape. Not even a 4-sided. The only one that holds its shape is a triangle, which is perfectly rigid in all dimensions. Well, in 3 dimensions, that becomes a tetrahedron. That's this shape here. Tetrahedron means it has 4 sides. But he says you can't have yin without yang. To have an energy event, you have to have 2 tetrahedra. And so Bunky says that this shape here, 2 tip-to-tip tetrahedra, is the building block of universe. This is the closest thing, he says, we will ever know to eternity in God. Well, if you take 4 of these and put them together, 1, 2, 3, 4, you get this shape here called a cuboctahedron. And Bunky says this is the ultimate shape because it has 4 of these tip-to-tip tetrahedra in them. And this shape, which has, you can see, triangular faces and square faces, has 12 vertices. Well, this also is connected to a thing called closest packing of spheres. If you have one sphere, exactly 12 spheres fit around it perfectly. It looks something like this. And so you'll see that there are triangular faces and square faces, and there are 12 balls packed around one in the center. Well, they always make this cuboctahedral shape. There's the triangle and there's the square. So they make this cuboctahedral shape, and the second layer has 42 spheres in it, and then the next layer has 92 spheres, and then 162 spheres in the 4th layer, and the 5th layer of spheres has exactly 252, John Dee's special number. So Buckminster Fuller studied numbers, and he studied how numbers work, and I found out that what he understood and figured out in the 1900s was the exact same thing that John Dee figured out in the 1500s. Much of the work, and I won't explain it all, has to do with the idea of Rotrosity. And so if you take a number like 29 and you flip it over 92, this is a very special relationship in here that gets created. And for example, in this chart of the numbers that you learned in the 1st grade, You've got all of the numbers 1 through 9, and then all the way up to 99. If you take that chart, flip it over backwards, and you'll get this chart that reads like Hebrew or Chinese. I haven't really changed anything. And then if you tilt that 45 degrees, you get this chart here. Now look, every number on this side has a perfect reflection on the other side. 12, 21, 13, 31, 14, 4. There's perfect symmetry in number. And these numbers, the single digits, 6, 7, 8, 9, the opposite of them is all themselves. The opposite of a 7 is a 7. So the first pair of opposites we have is 12 and 21, because they have 2 digits and they're opposite of each other. Well, guess what 12 times 21 equals? 252, John Dee's special number. So this 252 keeps occurring in different ways in nature. If you have one sphere, one circle, exactly 6 circles fit around it perfectly. Not 5, not 4, exactly. And if each one, exactly 6 fit around one, or there's 7 circles, if each one is 360 degrees, then that makes 7 times 360 is 2,520, which is 10 times 252. And this beautiful symmetry is exactly what you'll find if you cut this in half 4 different ways. So what's that got to do with the tower? Basically, this is what it has to do with the tower, and I'll explain to you if we come over to this board here. So I'll have you reset now.
Okay, rolling. Ready.
You tell me when you're ready.
Ready.
So what that has to do with the tower involves this tip-to-tip tetrahedra, the 2 tetrahedra, which I call a Bucky bow tie, because Bucky liked wearing bow ties, so I do it to honor him. But this is what Jim Egan says. I was a professional photographer for 40 years, and Jim Egan says the most economical way to depict the behavior of light in a camera obscura is 2 tip-to-tip tetrahedra. This shape here is what defines in the most economical way what's upright on one side is inverted on the other. Like if you have an upright triangle on one side, it's inverted on the other. And in a camera obscura, all the light rays crisscross as they come through the aperture in the center. So this is a depiction of the camera obscura, and it's built into the actual idea of this camera obscura. And Dee writes about it too, but he does it in a cryptic way. He says, if you take a tetrahedron, which when made full circle, means if you have both sides of it, a mirror may be found. That's the image, the mirror. And even when the sun is blocked by clouds, even happens on cloudy days, you just don't see the solar disk going across the wall, and can reduce any kinds of stone and metal into impalpable powders. Well, that's the image on the wall. You try and touch it, it's not there. It's like powder by the force of truly the very strongest heat. Well, that's just the sun that gives us all of our light, even on cloudy days. So this is all a riddle. He says, I can show you by actual experience that the element of earth can float above that of water. Well, if our kids are playing in the mud outside of his studio in London, and the Thames River is off beyond, inside Dee's studio, the element of earth floats above that of water. Dee writes also, he says, won't the astronomer regret his sleepless vigils and cold labors when he suffered under the open sky, when here, without any discomfort from the air, under his own roof, with windows and doors shut on all sides at any given time, he is able to observe the movements of the heavenly bodies, and indeed, without any mechanical instruments made from wood or brass. These are all riddles about the camera obscura, but academics, they think, oh, he's just talking about alchemy, they'll never understand it. All of my work is based on Elizabethan history, Rhode Island history, John Dee, history of mathematics, optics, and the history of time. That's about 1/10 of my library. Here's the hidden blueprint for the tower. Basically, you take the thus the world is created chart that I showed you and superimpose it on the title page. And it fits right in between the first 2 columns. Then you figure out the grid that he uses, which is 36 by 48. So in between the 2 columns, it's 24 by 48. This is the 2-to-1 proportion. And I claim that is the proportion of the tower. Here's my reproduction of how I think the tower originally looked. That's right. The one that you see outside that's just bare stones, I claim is just sort of what's left over from the tower. And in medieval and Renaissance times, they had a technique called sgraffito, where they would plaster something over and then faux paint it to make it look like marble or brick or stone. So underneath each of these pillars is 3.5 tons of stone that goes 4 feet down to bedrock. We know about that from the 1950 excavation by William Godfrey. And then these are the drums of the pillars, very solid bottom part. And they go up, and these ledges, I claim, was for an entablature, a piece of wood that would rest on these ledges that stick out there. And then these would have been pilasters held on by metal cramp irons made of wood to give the whole thing a classical look. And in classical buildings, every time you have a vertical member, you have a horizontal member, vertical, horizontal. So these arches weren't even meant to be seen. They're merely structural. And then another entablature at the top, and then a giant dome that would cover the whole thing. And once this was all made by the stones and held together, it held together solidly. And on the south side of the dome would be an aperture, and inside the dome room would be the Camera Obscura solar disk calendar, where the sun would go across the floor. Here it would be in December, which it is today, and then here it is in March. So the whole thing is a horologium, a building that keeps track of time. Not only a calendar on the interior, but the light shining through these two windows on the winter solstice, and then the moonlight shining through these two windows on the lunar minor. And there's another alignment which is with the North Star this way. The whole thing is a summary of what the cosmology that they knew about during the Renaissance, including the idea of the Camera Obscura. And Dee talks about the Camera Obscura very cryptically in his work. So John Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica is not only the correct proportions for the tower. In other words, the proportions of the tower are based on the specific proportions that John Dee talks about in his book, but it also has a bunch of riddles about it. Now, when I ask people what this looks like, they say, well, it kind of looks like a stick figure. Indeed, squatting, arms outstretched, and this is the head, and this is a bad hair day or a crown, maybe even the devil, but he dedicates this to Holy Roman Emperor, so I don't think he's given a picture of the devil to the Holy Roman Emperor. But if this is the head on this stick figure, what's that spot? Well, people sometimes say the nose. That's in the middle of your face. But your nose isn't very important. Once a day you smell something or something. What's the most important thing? Your eye. And in John Dee's, so this is a stick figure, and this is a cyclops, a thing with one eye. And that's exactly what the tower is. It's a giant cyclops, a thing that sees. And Dee leaves a lot of riddles about this. I'll just show you one of them because it's kind of fun. In his geometric construction of the tower of the symbol, he says this is A, this is B, this is C, D, E, F. Look at letter he uses to identify the I. The letter I, it's a homonym with the word I. They're both the same thing. So Dee has all these riddles like this, and if you can think in playful terms, then you can understand exactly what John Dee's tower, what his model is all about. So his Camera Obscura, basically, his idea of this eyeball is basically based on this idea of these four tip-to-tip tetrahedra fitting through here. And of course, the fifth layer of closest packing of spheres is Dee's number, 252. For more, you're going to have to read the book about it, but that's a little introduction into what's going on. And it's a lot of fun, but it's an interdisciplinary story. In other words, what Professor Penhallow found about astronomy, and what this fellow Robert Marshall found about the union of opposites in number, and what Fuller found out, and what I found out, Dee knew all of that stuff. That's what the book, the tower, and the symbol are all about. These are all the same thing. This guy was as smart as all of us 500 years ago or 400 years ago. That's pretty incredible. So I call it the John Dee Tower of 1583, a Renaissance building in America, and I've written a book called Elizabethan America that summarizes it, that you can buy on Amazon, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. So I'm hoping that I find people who will stand on my shoulders and take it even a step further and let the world know. So thank you very much. Talk to you later.